Hey folks, you're very welcome back to the Meditations on Movement podcast. Today's episode, we're going to be discussing the mistakes I've made in the past with injuries, and I also want to give you a bit of a framework for dealing with them. Injuries are an interesting thing. I think really what you have to do with injuries is you have to be aware that they're a part of the journey. You're never really going to avoid injuries, although obviously your training will, it's not like you're intentionally trying to injure yourself, or a trainer, an instructor, a coach, a teacher is ever trying to injure the person that they're working with. But you've just got to, I suppose, be aware that they will eventually come. An injury will eventually happen to you, unfortunately. To what scale then is sort of the way to look at it. I've, over my journey, I've had very small injuries. I wouldn't even call them injuries sometimes. Sometimes you might just classify them as like a little niggle, a little strain, something very, very small and marginal that doesn't really massively impact your training. You then look at sort of more chronic issues that might develop over time. Pain might not even be present, but you're just sort of aware that there's something there. There's something restricting you, limiting you in some way. As I said, almost not even classified as an injury, to be frank. But then you obviously have what you would term as an actual injury, and this is something that really stops you in your tracks. When you're doing something at the time, there might be a case where sort of like adrenaline takes over. You might be able to push through something, and then only after you really realize how much of a significant issue it was. But it does limit you. It makes you stop. It brings about a little bit of pain, all those sort of things. I've had small ones like that. I've had big ones. One of my bigger ones that I had was my knee. I had this, what must have been around... it must have been around 2016, 2017. My time or ability to look back in time and put a year to it is terrible. But basically, this was a knee injury that I got when I was training Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu at the time. Funny sport, and you get put in a lot of weird and awkward positions, and you've obviously got someone that you are rolling against. So they are basically trying to snap a limb in some sense, if you want to put it bluntly. But how this sort of happened for me was I was getting out of position. I was sort of like awkwardly escaping and sort of like getting to my feet and pushing my opponent away from me. In the process of sort of doing so, it was my left side, so I was sort of like internally rotated. And there was just sort of pressure put on my knee sort of as I was being forced back, as he was trying to retain the position. And not that I heard something go pop, but there was obviously a lot of discomfort around the knee at the time. Like, it wasn't like an ACL injury or anything like that. It was actually a damaged meniscus. But it was the kind of thing, as I said there, it was like I was able to continue. I was able to do something at the time, but it was only afterwards that I really realized the extent of it. My meniscus was damaged to the point that it got very, very inflamed almost straight away. Very hard to walk on it. Gave it some time, and it was the kind of thing where I was like, right, it's not really stopping me in my tracks, but I'm trying to do something with it. But it's only when you go back into sort of your normal training that you then really realize how bad the issue might be. And for me, that was the case. I kind of got back into my regular sort of like resistance training at the time that I was doing. I was doing a lot of heavy lifting and stuff like that. Like, I would kind of term it as powerlifting training, but not to that extent. Like, I was looking at sort of like heavier lifts, squat, benching, and deadlifting and stuff like that. But then kind of integrating it with a little bit of bodybuilding training and stuff like that. And then obviously some stuff as well, because I was doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu at the time. There was kind of a little bit of sports performance stuff integrated in there as well. But what that meant for me then was it was noticeable straight away. Not a lot of strength, not a lot of stability in the knee. And I knew it was a significant issue that I really had to take a step back and go, okay, this needs to be analysed and looked at. Silly me at the time decided not to go and get it checked and decided to work on it myself. I've had previous issues with going to physios, and I have never really found one that quite worked for me. The first experience that I had with a physio was for a shoulder issue. This was just like a little bit of an impingement almost. I was once again, I suppose I was doing a lot more bodybuilding training at the time, so a lot of restricted ranges of motion that I've been working in, and a lot of heavy lifting. And it was probably a case where I just wasn't giving my body enough time to sort of rest and integrate in the likes of mobility stuff, making sure that everything was just sort of moving within good ranges of motion. And I was getting a pinching sensation kind of near my shoulder when I was going into flexion. So when I was putting my arm overhead, I was getting a bit of pinching pain. And when I went to the physio, it was the kind of thing where I was like, right, it is stopping me a little bit, and I need to address it now, obviously. And I was just told to stretch my lats. And it was an interesting one because I was kind of like, went through all these assessments, gave them all the spiel of like what's going on. And then I was told, yeah, just stretch your lats. And I was kind of like, that's not enough, surely, went away, stretched my lats, but also looked into doing a lot more other stuff. Like, this is really around the time that I was in college at the time, studying sports science and health. So it was the kind of thing where I was looking and going, okay, you're telling me to stretch it, but that might help to a certain degree in terms of getting rid of maybe a little bit of the restriction and the pain, but how am I supposed to really work in a full way around it? Like, I'm sure there's loads of things that I could have been doing that I wasn't given really. So that was unfortunate at the time because that was really my first experience. And I have talked to physios, and I have, had good conversations with physio. I had a roommate of mine who was a physio at the time. And she said certainly that, like, as time has progressed, you do have certain places where it's just, there may be cut away or they find themselves away from what would be the best practices of a physiotherapist. They're not keeping up to date with common practices, common research, their own practices and themselves. So they kind of cut themselves off in some sense, and they just don't grow, unfortunately. So when you go to those, they might just give you very little and then not really integrate it with good, say, like strength programming, for example. That was one of the things that I was sort of happy to hear with a previous roommate of mine she was saying that a lot of the time what they're moving now towards is less passive means, less massage therapy, all that sort of stuff that we would sort of assume to some degree that we're going to get when we go into a physio. And they said a lot of the time it's just about making sure that the person can obviously, you're giving them movements that they can do, that they can try out, that are obviously going to strengthen up the area, reduce pain a little bit, but eventually progress into more sort of strength training, basically, because that's really how you're going to see an injury improve. And that's sort of like, when I look back on it, it's funny because I had that negative experience with a physiotherapist, but it really got me into this space of, I am grateful for all my injuries. And that's one thing I think is hard for people to see at the time, certainly when you're in the thick of it, is it's not easy when dealing with an injury. And something that I think is overlooked really is the psychological impact of what an injury has on someone. Like my shoulder injury, as I said, not really much of an impact. It kind of just impeded me a little bit. But as I said, got my, I dipped into it. I started looking at the likes of integrating all of these sort of things properly, making sure that I wasn't just doing, bicep curls till the cows come home. I made sure that I sort of balanced things off and found out these different approaches, and eventually it snowballs one thing into the next. But the knee injury, as I said, was one that really stopped me in my tracks because it was such a significant injury. Completely stopped me in terms of my training. And I just found myself, I often say this about the injury, I just found myself, when I think back to it, I was taking, I was taking one step forward and two steps back. Just making a little bit of progress, seeing some changes, but then I would do something that would aggravate it and it would just flare up. And it was the most frustrating thing because I could never really pinpoint it down to one or two things, saying okay, this causes inflammation and stops it, so obviously I need to avoid these things. And I was just, spinning my wheels, just trying to find these different approaches and different ways that I could sort of look at it. And that's what got me to sort of change my approaches, research, and do all of these different things. So that's why in some ways I am grateful for my injuries. But when I think back to the psychological impact that it was having me at the time, I was the most depressed I've ever been when I think about it. I couldn't move my body properly. I was active at the time as well as a personal trainer. it just really, really got in the way of things. I was on my feet all day, and one of the days I remember, this would have been like, say, if the injury happened, this would have been maybe a month or a month and a half later, where, I'd been trying out different things, but then aggravating it, spinning my wheels. Some days I was just like, fuck, I'm just not going to train today because it's just annoying me, getting into this whole thing. And I just remember one day walking home from work. I had started early, done a few sessions, was walking home, and I had to stop every 10 minutes or so. Walk itself might have been about 30-40 minutes, but I had to stop 3 or 4 times, just because I was like, my knee is so badly inflamed, I can't walk anymore. So you can start to see in some sense how that obviously has a very significant impact on your psychological health at the time, and how important it is obviously to see that as a side of injuries that you really have to kind of learn to overcome, bringing a little bit of patience to the situation, understanding your frustration, trying to deal with it in very sort of positive ways, and not just sort of catastrophizing, which is what we often do with those injuries. And I'm sure if you're someone on the other side of this who's going through an injury right now, or has gone through an injury in the past, you know exactly what I'm talking about in that sense. And sometimes that's something that actually hinders us in terms of our progress, that we have to overcome. And that's something that I hope to kind of discuss a little bit later, in terms of a bit of a framework that's going to help you get an understanding of that. I want to touch on, in a sense, the idea of passive modalities. This is sort of an interesting area in terms of thinking about injuries, that I think people often go to almost straight away. I'm not saying passive modalities aren't useful in some way. Like if I think of a passive modality like passive stretching, even something along the lines of, like a massage gun, a foam roller, or something like that. Even some forms of manual therapy, like going to get a massage for a muscle that seems a little bit strained and stuff like that. It's not to say that they're entirely useless. Oftentimes what you're getting out of it is a little bit of an analgesic effect, where you're just reducing the pain a little bit, which is very, it's good to some degree. If you're stretching out the muscle on a very regular basis, you're certainly moving it about a bit, but it's not the only thing that you can be doing. If we're looking at more active means, as I've mentioned, this idea of, say, like strength training, in some capacity, strength training might mean a completely different thing from one person to the next, so that's something I might clarify a little bit later. But looking to sort of strengthen and move in some capacity, because you have to reintegrate that injured area back into the entire system, and that's something, unfortunately, that passive modalities don't really offer you. There'd be very, very limited cases where you'd get the idea of just being able to kind of like move passively and then be fine. And if you were to look at someone that were just doing that, I'm sure that they were doing other stuff. They just weren't aware of it. They had a little bit of a small, as I said, the idea of maybe like a niggle that you wouldn't even classify as an injury, stretched out the area a little bit, but then they probably got back and still moved it in some form of training. And it was probably that stuff that was really helping the injury heal. The passive stretching was just giving a little bit of a pain relief. Even the idea of, say, like bandaging up an issue. This is something I think that's very interesting when you see the likes of arch supports and stuff like that. Like I saw one of my mates on Instagram talking about this day, Andrew Mitchell. He's at Resilient Beings. I think he was talking about it with someone where, you get this idea of like, you've got a high arch, a low arch, something like that in your foot, or you've got leg length discrepancies. That's always an interesting one. And the idea is to wear some form of implant or whatever, and not completely disregarding it, not saying that it's entirely useless. And then obviously for some people as well, the idea of, say, like a support of some sort while injured, or telling someone not to move in a certain way, or to do certain movements, can help, but it often leaves people with this idea of never doing that thing again. And what I feel like the bandages and stuff like that, like an arch support might do, is it would often make people kind of think, okay, cool, the issue is now just dealt with, and I don't really have to address anything in terms of my foot. When there's so much that you could do, there's so much that you could look at in terms of strengthening the foot, strengthening the ankle, mobilizing the area, reintegrating it with different movements, overall back to that idea of sort of strength training, what we're looking at. So those sort of like passive means, they're just sort of putting a band-aid over it and going, yeah, cool, don't worry about it anymore. And while that might suit some people, you'll often find that it will lead to another issue, most likely. You know, especially if you're coming into it with say some sort of restriction or some sort of pain that's present, it'll usually just morph it in some way. We see this idea of what's the term? It escapes my mind. Very long pause. Apologies. The term has escaped my mind, but it's this idea of a compensation. Jesus Christ, there we go. That was going to be annoying me a lot. But a compensation basically is where, like, say for example, you were to do something, or you just find that you had an injury and you were dealing with it for a long period of time. The body might compensate in some way to try and protect or maneuver about whatever that issue might be. You see this with a lot of people who maybe aren't active, having an injury, something that they injure, and they don't address it, they don't do anything about it, and then suddenly, you know, the hip is next, the shoulder is next, whatever it is, because you're often redistributing tension or forces to another part of the body that isn't really equipped for it. Certainly if you're an untrained individual, and you might find that the sort of rest of the body isn't really strong enough and able to handle that sort of load. It just leads to a chain of sort of issues. And it can certainly happen with active people as well, where you might find, you know, if someone has a hip issue, they might favor the other side a little bit more, small things like that. And it's not to see that compensation is overall is a really bad thing. They're just a sort of necessary thing. Oftentimes it's sort of seen as like the compensation is actually what's sort of saving you in some way. So don't just think that you have to get rid of the compensation. It's kind of leads into the framework that I'm going to give you a little bit later as to sort of how we might look at these things and sort of addressing them. I've touched on a few things already, certainly. One thing I have a few notes out in front of me here that I want to touch on is the idea of rest. I've already gone on to one of these points. I just want to make sure that this sort of leads into what would be the framework that I want to discuss later. To be honest with you, I've dealt with a lot of those things, so rest will sort of lead into the framework that I want to give you. This idea of rest might not be the best option for you, really, is the way that we want to think of this. We often see that old acronym of RICE given: rest, ice, compression, and elevation for an injury. It's actually better termed POLICE now, which is protect it. OL stands for optimally load, and then ice, compress, and elevate. Even then, ice is being seen as a less than favorable strategy sometimes, especially for, like, you know, doing it with everything. Inflammation is really seen as a part of the process of healing. So sometimes excessive icing can actually blunt that process of the injury and slow down the healing process in some sense. Now, I'm not saying don't ice. I'm not saying for like big injuries and stuff like that, like you see a lot of people using anti-inflammatories, but I would just say use them sparingly. Don't feel like you have to overuse them. Like when I hear some people with anti-inflammatories, they almost use them for everything, and it's kind of like, okay, like you don't really need to use them too much. You know, if you might just move the body a bit, it might feel okay, or it's just sort of straight away. It's like, okay, issue paracetamol or Panadol or something, or Nurofen or something like that, you know, straight into the body. But really what we're trying to get at here is rest often doesn't aid the injury, because sometimes what we need is we need movement to sort of help with the healing process, but not necessarily like really, really heavy loaded movement. Like, as I said, optimally load the area. So this is for dealing with like sort of more significant injuries. Ones that, as I said, sort of stop you in your tracks. You're looking at that optimal loading and just saying, okay, if I need to take weight off the area, like if it's an ankle strain, you're obviously protecting it, taking weight off it whenever you can, compressing it, elevating it and stuff like that, just to sort of help. But one thing that will sort of really help is very, very light movement on a regular basis, just to sort of aid what would be sort of like the blood flow and everything like that to the area. While you might not be able to work directly on the area in question, like certainly within the immediate sort of phases of an injury, that sort of first few hours where you might just be sort of something might swell up entirely. But when you feel sort of necessary, when you can say get like a little bit of movement in that really doesn't cause any pain, that's certainly going to be beneficial to the whole process. I've heard of someone who was who got a knee injury, an ACL tear, and instead of like completely leaving the knee sort of isolated, they were trying to move it in whatever sort of limited range they could, so that the inflammation didn't just completely balloon and leave the knee sort of inaccessible. So I suppose that's looking at it as like, when is ice actually necessary a lot of the time. So that's where I'm saying, okay, don't, like, you get a break, a fracture, anything like that, don't not ice it. Do you know what I mean? It's those sort of times when, you might get a little bit of a strain where suddenly you're thinking of icing every 15 minutes when it might not be necessary. So when it comes to the idea of rest, very, very limited circumstances are we really going to need like lots and lots of rest. It's really best to look at it and just integrate in almost straight away. And this brings us almost to the framework that I want to give you as well. And this is a framework that I've sort of thought about over the years. The categories are something that I have to attribute to someone else, to my teacher Marcello. These are 3 different sort of categories of looking at how you might look at the movements now, but they were always sort of a thing that I sort of had in mind myself, but it was put brilliantly by him. So that's why I feel like I have to give credit to him, certainly. But this idea of, you've got the idea of working on the injury, so work on it. You've got the idea of working around the injury, and then you've got the idea of working with the industry. So those 3, working on it, working around it, and working with it. So all of us know in some sense, or maybe we don't, maybe we do, that we need to work on the injury. So if I take, for example, a recent injury that I got, I had like sort of an ankle issue. There was certainly stuff that I was doing to work on it. I was looking at it and saying, okay, like assessments are certainly an important part of the process. That's why you go to like, say, like a physio. They might assess sort of range of motion limitations and stuff like that. They might assess strength, just to sort of see, okay, even coordination, balance, stability, those sort of things. They're assessing those sort of things to see, okay, what are the things that are now limited that need to be sort of reintegrated. So this idea of, that's where the idea maybe like working on it might come in, where you say, okay, I'm specifically addressing the injury, building back I hit the mic, building back, say, the range of motion that's been lost, working on, say, the specific area of strength that I need to redevelop. Like for me, it was this idea of the tilting of the ankle, and certainly ankle plantar flexion, that idea of bringing the toes towards the knee. So I was building up the sort of things that I was doing and making sure that I was sort of like strengthening the area, mobilizing it. And that would certainly be deemed as this idea of working on it. But this is where I feel people get sort of stuck, is they only focus really on working on it, when really what we should be doing is looking at dividing our time, I suppose, sort of equally in some sense, between that working on it, working around it, and working with it. Working around it then is sort of looking at the injury and saying, okay, it's affecting me in such and such a range of motion, or it's affecting me in such and such a movement path. Looking at it and saying, okay, these are the things that maybe bring about pain. What are the things that I can actually do to work around it? Make sure, obviously if it's an ankle issue, an easy thing to think of is, I take and I can still do a lot of my upper body movements. But then you sort of ask yourself, okay, well, like what sort of things can I potentially do with the lower limbs that isn't going to be affected by the ankle? Like for me, I was still able to do a lot of squatting, a lot of lunging. That wasn't really bringing me into a lot of, deep dorsiflexion. So it didn't really have a negative impact on the range of motion. So that's the idea of sort of like working around it. And this is, I feel, a really important part of the injury process, is we get stuck on that idea of the injury. We get stuck on this idea of working on it. And we only really focus on those things. We go into an individual like a physio, a trainer, someone like that, and they tell us all the things that we can't do. And while that's relevant and necessary, to an injury and to the process of like rehabilitation and recovery, we completely overlook all of the things that we can do. And this is what I think actually contributes a lot to the it certainly contributes to the rehabilitation process. Like, we need to be able to reintegrate ourselves back into the movements that we were doing previously. That's obviously a good sort of look at that process, getting it perfect. But as I was saying about the sort of psychological stress that might happen as a result of an issue, an injury, is the fixation on the injury. You suddenly look at your training and it's all focused in on this idea of working on it. And while that might give us a sort of positive feedback in terms of saying, yes, my injury is getting better, but sometimes the progress is sort of so slow, sometimes those sort of modalities are very monotonous, very boring, that they keep us stuck in our tracks, and they almost completely take us back to this point where we feel, I'm losing all of my ability to do, or we feel as if we're losing all of our ability to do, like the more expressive or the more expansive, the more dynamic things that we're maybe doing in our training that were really giving us a lot of the enjoyment, we've now completely taken those out of our training. So that's a really important part. This next part of kind of working around it is making sure that the programs or whatever you're doing still really focuses on things that you can do, even if it's looking at like partial range of motion in a certain movement because of an injury or something like that. It still means that you're moving. It's just we've taken what is this sort of advice of what you can't do, and we've expanded it out into all these different areas. If we were to make a list, we could make a massive one about all the things that we can do, and we'd probably have a very small list, a very important list of the things that we can't do, but we fixate and we focus on that thing of like what we can't do, and we don't even we almost shy away, and we don't even look at the things that we can do. That's where I feel where a lot of people get the sort of the process of dealing with an injury wrong, or just not in the best way, is that fixation on the things that you can't do. So a really, really important part, like 2 steps of this framework, really is the working on it and working with it. And I suppose the difference between working on it, working around it, and working with it, what I've just said there, obviously working on it was the specifics of the actual injury itself, those things that I was saying there for my ankle that I was doing. Then I was working around it with the things of like squats and whatever like that. This next one takes a bit of time to sort of understand and comprehend, but this idea of working with it, I had it when I had a knee issue, and even the ankle issue was sort of like integrated into it as well, where I was going through certain ranges of motion, and this idea of working with it is being as conscious as possible, understanding that, okay, I'm using it in a way that is maybe a little bit more dynamic, a little bit less sort of restricted and rigid, and there is possibility of sort of aggravating it. And that's obviously a measured thing that you need to do, this idea of working with it. Opening yourself to scenarios that maybe just thread the line of comfort and confidence. If you have, say, for example, a range, you could think of movements that are green, you could think of movements that are orange, and movements that are red. Movements that are green are obviously movements that you go, okay, these movements are not going to aggravate my injury. You look at the ones that are orange, and you kind of go, I need to really be focused and conscious when I do these orange ones. There's the potential for them to aggravate me, and I just need to make sure I take it slow when I first do them, for example. And in the red ones, you just go, okay, this is what I was saying about those things that you just can't do. You look at them and you go, it would be silly and stupid of me to go and pretend to try and do those movements, so I'm just going to steer clear of them. This work with it, I feel, really looks at those orange movements, those movements that you deem as like, I've got to focus here. I've got to make sure that I'm concentrating. I'm not being stupid because I'm moving in a range that maybe isn't comfortable. There's maybe less confidence. Maybe I might be asking myself to sort of balance and coordinate something with my leg that isn't quite there at the moment. So I have to be smart. I have to potentially slow the movement down. I have to potentially reduce the range. I have to potentially reduce the load. All of these different things that you can do to just slowly reintegrate those things. And that's where I feel this sort of 3-part category system, this way of sort of thinking about it, is something that I would have done, but I just wasn't looking at it in these terms, in these categories. So that's why I have to certainly credit Marcello for giving me this sort of framework when I had an injury during the year last year, where I had the issue with my ankle, and you could see that I was obviously sort of getting frustrated with a lot of things. but he was certainly keep nudging me, just saying like, look, work on it, work around it, work with it. That's what's going to help you sort of like bring forward. You know, it wasn't something that he was saying in my ear all the time. It was something that he just sort of mentioned as like, look, this is a process that I've gone about with my injuries in the past, and it's always worked for me. And it was seeing it when he said it, I was sort of like, yes, I could see my own fault. I could see almost like when I thought back to all of my smaller injuries, bigger injuries, all of my injuries in some sense, I could see where I was maybe dedicating too much time to one area, maybe dedicating too much time to the working on it, so much to the point that I just sort of like lost interest in training, was getting bored, was getting frustrated, and as I said, I was getting fixated almost on the injury, and then maybe not giving enough time to sort of this idea of working around it and working with it. So certainly this is a framework that sort of helped me, and it's something I'm sure that will sort of evolve over time. Like, I mean, when I think about it back to sort of like the first injury or two that I had, you know, I had a certain framework back then of how I would have dealt with things, and it's pushed me in certain ways. As I said, I'm now able to look at my injuries and sort of see the alternate side of it and say I'm actually grateful, because they force me to look at my own understanding of the body, how I see things sort of operate, the lenses that I use as a teacher and a coach, and what I can sort of get better at in terms of comprehending what the issue is and then being able to solve those sort of issues. So hopefully you've got a lot from that as well. There was quite a lot of things that we went through in terms of obviously my history, some sort of things that I would maybe avoid, rationale and reasoning behind injuries themselves as a thing to contend with, and then hopefully that framework as well, that idea of working on it, working around it, and working with it should help you in terms of addressing injuries in your own life. Okay. Really appreciate you taking the time to sort of listen in to the podcast. I'm contemplating potentially just releasing this not as sort of a private thing and just making it sort of open, releasing it on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. I'll have to look into that. I might even release this episode on it, so you never know. You could be listening to it right now in terms of an open source and not on my email list. But if there's any topics or anything like that you guys would like me to cover in the future, be sure to let me know. I'd be really interested just in hearing what are those kind of things, and you know, that you're either having an issue with or just want to dive deeper into, or maybe want a helping hand exploring. I'd be happy to do that. I certainly have loads of topics of sort of podcasts and stuff that I'm going to sort of keep in my mind when I'm sort of researching and reading and stuff like that. So I'll hopefully be able to bring them to the podcast soon. I'd appreciate it as well if you think that this would help someone. Certainly injuries, you know, you might know someone with an injury, and if you feel they're sort of spinning their wheels or not getting the best out of their issue, or it's something that they've constantly been dealing with, maybe send this to them. That might be something to help them. But I'd really appreciate that if you were to share the podcast in some capacity, either now or in the future. Okay. For the moment, folks, I'll leave it at that, and I will see you soon.